So far, what have we learned what was something new that we learned in chapter 2? So chapter 1, we learned about his background. We learned about him being separated from his mother, right? What were some things that we learned in chapter 2? Okay, we learned about the Lloyds. We learned about like his life on the plantation, right? What else did we learn?
Slaves sing songs to make you feel better.
Okay, so they have their songs, right? And what did we learn particularly about the songs that was like maybe a little opposite than what we are used to?
They speak the truth.
Okay, they speak what?
Happiness. Like, they don't sing because they're happy. They sing.
Okay, they don't sing. And so when they sing a song that is not happy, what is the pace or sound of the song? It's happy, yeah. So it's like opposite of what it would be, what we would think it to be, right? So the slower songs are what?
Happy.
The slower songs are happy, okay? And he described it yesterday as something that is like soothing to them, right? Like singing the song is something that is soothing to them. Okay. Ready? Here we go. Chapter 3. Colonel Lloyd kept a large and finely cultivated garden which afforded almost constant employment for 4 men besides the chief gardener, Mr. Dumond. This garden was probably the greatest attraction of the place. During the summer months, people came from far and near, from Baltimore, Easton, and Annapolis to see it. So this is from the north. So I'm just kind of jotting down that the garden needed 5 men to take care of it, which means that it was pretty substantial. Can y'all see that okay? It abounded in fruits of almost every description, from the hardy apple of the north to the delicate orange of the south. This garden was not the least source of trouble on the plantation. Its excellent fruit was quite a temptation to the hungry swarms of boys, as well as the older slaves belonging to the colonel, few of whom had the virtue or the vice to resist it. Okay, so what is, the garden was not the least source of trouble, not the least source. What does that mean? So it's not the least source. It's the what?
The most.
It's the most. Yeah, so Douglas does this quite a bit where he does like, it sounds like the opposite of what he's saying, right? It's not the least, which means it is the most. So it caused and why did the garden cause the most problems? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, and you think something fresh like that, because what did we find out yesterday that they get?
7 pounds of pork and cornmeal.
Yeah. So, and it's not even good pork. You're talking like the fatty part of the pork, right? So you're not talking like pork chops and tenderloins and all that. You're talking like the fat part of the pork, the throwaway part, right? So that's all they had. So when they had the ability to have something fresh, right? I mean, there's an orange tree right there. And think of how much they would want that, right? And they couldn't, but they did. Its excellent fruit was quite a temptation to the hungry swarm of boys, as well as the older slaves belonging to the colonel, few of whom had the virtue or vice to resist it. Scarcely a day passed during the summer, but that some slave had to take the lash for stealing fruit. So they knew that if they got caught, that they would get whipped. But they still did it. It shows you how much they wanted that, right? The colonel had to resort to all kinds of stratagems to keep his slaves out of the garden. The last and most successful one was that of tarring his fence all around. After which, if a slave was caught with any tar upon his person, so this is body, right? It was deemed sufficient proof that he had either been into the garden or had tried to get in. So do y'all understand what he did?
Yeah.
So hot tar, like it's sticky, right? Put it all over the fence. So when you try to climb the fence, you have it on your hands or your feet. And so anytime you're walking around, you're going to have evidence of it on you. After which, if a slave was caught with any tar upon, did I read that person? It was deemed sufficient to be in the garden. In either case, he was severely whipped by the chief gardener. So notice who, it's not the slave, it's not like the plantation owner. This one was the chief gardener. Had to punish. Now remember yesterday we talked about the idea of how slavery dehumanizes slaves. And so we haven't really looked at or considered how it affects the slave owners, right? Well, here the slave owner isn't even doling out the punishment, a gardener, right? And he's like, that's not what I do. I pick vegetables and fruit. Like, that's my job, right? So here the gardener had to do it. This plan worked well. The slaves became as fearful of tar as of the lash. They seemed to realize the impossible of touching tar without being defiled. The colonel also kept a splendid riding equipage. His stable and carriage house presented the appearance of some of our large city livery establishments, and that's like a horse establishment. His horses were of the finest form and noblest blood. His carriage house contained 3 splendid coaches, 3 or 4 gigs, besides Dearborns and barouches of the most fashionable style. Okay, so look at this question. Explain the irony here and notice the difference in the paragraph. So this paragraph, paragraph 1 is what, 17 lines? Paragraph 2 is how many lines? 5?
6. Oh, no.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so when you look at analysis, you say, okay, where is the focus? The focus of those 2 paragraphs is on what? Look at the length. Which is what's in the first paragraph.
Garden?
And, yeah. So not only is the passage about that equates to every day. The majority of the day is focused on beating slaves, right? Whereas a little bit of the day is like their wealth and extravagance. This establishment was under the care of 2 slaves, Old Barney and Young Barney, father and son. So remember, we are going to write down like the people so that when we go back, we'll know. To attend to this establishment was their sole work, but it was by no means an easy employment, for in nothing was Colonel Lloyd more particular than in the management of his horses. The slightest inattention to these was unpardonable. Base word in there is what? So not forgivable. The slightest inattention to these was unpardonable, and was visited upon those under whose care they were placed with the severest punishment. No excuse could shield them. If the colonel only suspected any want of attention to his horses, a supposition which he frequently indulged, and one which, of course, made the office of Old and Young Barney a very trying one. All right, so what does that mean? Oh, sorry. So what does that mean?
The care for the horses was never good enough.
Yeah. And notice that Colonel Lloyd never stepped in himself to do it, right? But he was never pleased with how it was being done. So old Barney and young Barney always kind of took the brunt of that. They never knew when they were safe from punishment. They were frequently whipped when least deserving and escaped whipping when most deserving. Everything depended upon the looks of the horses and the state of Colonel Lloyd's own mind when his horses were brought to him for use. If a horse did not move fast enough or hold his head high enough, it was owing to some fault of his keeper's. It was painful to stand near the stable door and hear the various complaints against the keepers when a horse was taken out for use. This horse has not had proper attention. He has not been sufficiently rubbed and curried, or he has not been properly fed. His food was too wet or too dry. He got it too soon or too late. He was too hot or too cold. He had too much hay or not enough of grain. Or he had too much grain and not enough of hay. Instead of old Barney's attending to the horse, he had very improperly left it to his son. So these are all the excuses excuses Lloyd used to beat the Barneys. All right, so let's take a second. Are y'all caught up to where we're writing? All right, so let's take a second and read this box because this is kind of the section that we just covered. So notice that Douglas is using a motif of contrast throughout his biography, both literally in the sentences and metaphorically in the meaning. Do you remember contrast in the prior two chapters? Any more in this chapter? So notice what I've done is anytime that we have a term, I've defined it in the gray down at the bottom, right? So motif is this a distinctive feature or dominant idea. So a motif is this repetition of this idea or imagery that you see over and over again, right? So here we see the repetition of contrast, right? So you see everything that is and then here is this repetition, right? His food was too wet, too dry, too soon, too late, too hot, too cold, too much hay, not enough grain, too much grain, not enough hay. Instead of old Barney's attending to the horse, he had improperly left it to his son. So there is that motif of contrast. So here is where we see and he has a tendency to do this quite a bit throughout his writing, is this idea of it's kind of like what I call this motif, like this example is like the, not the Three Little Pigs, the bears. Goldilocks and the Three Bears. No caffeine, it's starting to kick in. So you know how like Goldilocks goes and tastes the porridge and one's too hot, one's too cold, and one's just right? Except for Mr. Lloyd, Colonel Lloyd is never just right. It's always in the extremes. To all these complaints, no matter how unjust, the slave must answer never a word. Colonel Lloyd could not brook any contradiction from a slave. David, will you look up brook? B-R-O-O-K? David.
Sorry, it's bringing up like the small stream.
Yep, look at like the second or third definition.
There isn't one.
Colonel Lloyd could not brook any contradiction, so I would say that would mean like take.
Stand.
Do what?
It would probably mean like withstand.
Take or understand would be my guess.
Tolerate or allow?
Tolerate, yeah. When he spoke, a slave must stand, listen, and tremble. And such was literally the case. So notice that this is inaction of the slave. So again, we talk about control, right? There's control again. And such was literally the case. I have seen Colonel Lloyd make old Barney, a man between 50 and 60 years of age, uncover his bald head, kneel down upon the cold, damp ground, and receive upon his naked and toil-worn shoulders more than 30 lashes at a time. Colonel Lloyd had 3 sons, Edward, Murray, and Daniel, and 3 sons-in-laws, Mr. Winder, Mr. Nicholson, and Mr. Lowndes. All of these lived at the Great House Farm and enjoyed the luxury of whipping servants when they pleased, from old Barney down to William Wykes, the coach driver. What's weird about that word enjoyed?
Pleasure, enjoy misery.
Yeah. And that's something that we don't look at, right? So again, I think that's like part of the dehumanization of man, especially on the slave owners, is that they had this luxury to enjoy whipping their slaves. I have seen Winder make one of the house servants stand off from him a suitable distance to be touched with the end of his whip, and at every stroke raise great ridges upon his back. To describe the wealth of Colonel Lloyd would be almost equal to describing the riches of Job. He kept from 10 to 15 house servants. He was said to own 1,000 slaves and think this estimate quite within the truth. Colonel Lloyd owned so many that he did not know them when he saw them, nor did all the slaves of the out farms know him. It is reported of him that while riding along the road one day, he met a colored man and addressed him in the usual manner of speaking to colored people to the public highways of the South. "Well, boy, whom do you belong?" "To Colonel Lloyd," replied the slave. "Well, does the colonel treat you well?" "No, sir," was the ready reply. What does he work you too hard?" "Yes, sir." "Well, don't he give you enough to eat?" "Yes, sir, he gives me such as it is." Okay, so who's asking these questions? Yeah. So notice this little note. Even for the first time period, this was indeed a huge amount of wealth and property. In, that should be 1860, a slave cost about $40,000 in adjustment to today's dollars. That would put Lloyd's wealth in slaves alone around $40 million today. So notice this question. To what degree did any slave have any freedom of speech? And why was this dealt with as harshly as more overt or physical disobedience? What was at stake? So to what extent do slaves have free speech? Why do you think speaking your mind as a slave was more harsh than like eating a piece of fruit? What does free speech, what does them being able to speak freely, how does that threaten a slave owner?
There's no control.
Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Control's fine.
So physically they can stop them. But I would say free speech is more like the mental side, right? So the mental is tougher. Give me about 10 more minutes, then we're done. The colonel, after ascertaining where the slave belonged, rode on. The man also went on about his business, not dreaming that he had been conversing with his master. So Colonel Lloyd had so many slaves that he didn't know them, and they didn't know him, right? So he didn't know when they came across him.
Did you know who they belonged to?
No, because he had so many, right? He thought, said, and heard nothing more of the matter until 2 or 3 weeks later. The poor man was then informed by his overseers that, for having found fault with his master, he was now to be sold to a Georgia trader. He was immediately chained and handcuffed, and thus, without a moment's warning, he was snatched away and forever sundered from his family and friends by a hand more unrelenting than death. This is the penalty of telling the truth, of telling the simple truth in answer to a series of plain questions. So notice that they're not speaking out against anything, right? So was it a lie? No. So the slave got in trouble for telling the truth. And telling the truth about how they're fed and how they're treated. Okay, why would going from a New England slave community, where's New England?
New York.
Okay, the North. From a New England slave community to a Southern one be so catastrophic, so scary? Who was the first to get rid of slavery?
Abraham Lincoln.
The North, right? So why, what can you consider about the North then during this time period?
Heaven.
They're what? They're more what?
More lenient.
Yeah, they're more open to new ideas, right? So there's going to be a different treatment in the North than there is in the South, right? So if you are a slave from the North going to the South, you're going into the deep South, which is we're keeping our slaves for as long as we can, right? Where the North, it is partly in consequence of such facts that slaves, when inquired of as to their condition and the character of their masters, almost universally say they are contented and their masters are kind. The slaveholders have been known to send in spies among their slaves to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition. The frequency of this has had the effect to establish among the slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. And a maxim is like a saying or a proverb, right? What does that mean? A still tongue makes a wise head. Yeah. And how terrible it is to think that like they had like spies within their own group, so they couldn't even have trusted the people that they were with. They suppress the truth rather than take the consequence of telling it, and in so doing, prove themselves a part of their human family. If they have anything to say of their masters, it is generally in their master's favor, especially when speaking to an untried man. Untried means, yeah, not trusted. I have been frequently asked when a slave if I had a kind master, and do not remember ever to have given a negative answer, nor did I in pursuing. Miss Smith. Hey. Yeah. No, I mean, unless the teacher says, but I would usually order, crap. I would go with one of the top ones. It's Sig, starts with S, Signet, something like that. Yeah, sometimes it'll be in there, like it'll have like different, yeah, that's a hard book. Sometimes it'll say that it has like different, if it has like a dictionary in the back of it, like read for that. Like sometimes it will have like footnote, endnotes. Yeah, don't buy that, because he can get, I can't think, not Spark Notes. What's the other one we use? Not Spark Notes, but, no, the Spark Notes are new. There's something else. I'll send it to you. There's something better than that. Yeah, Signet, I think, SIGNET, I think is a good one. Yeah. Okay, all right, bye. Sorry. All right, 5 more minutes and then we're done. Am I right around here? Slaves are like other people and imbibe and prejudices quite common to others. Imbibe. Somebody, IMBIBE. IMBIBE.
Drink, absorb, or assimilate.
Absorb. So, moreover, slaves are like other people. They absorb prejudices quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves. And this, too, in some cases, when the very reverse is true. Indeed, it is not uncommon for slaves even to fall out and quarrel among themselves about the relative goodness of their masters. Why is that crazy? They are fighting each other that my master is better than yours. What is insane about that? They're still slaves under these masters, right? That's like insanity. Each contending for the superior goodness of his own over that of the others. At the very same time, they mutually execrate their masters when viewed separately. So, execrate, EXECRATE. I think it's like talk bad about, I think.
Feel or express great loathing for us.
Yeah, great loathing.
Archaic is curse and swear.
Curse and swear, good. It was so on our plantation. When Colonel Lloyd's slaves met the slaves of Jacob Jepson, they seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters. Colonel Lloyd's slaves contending that he was the richest, and Mr. Jepson's slaves that he was the smartest and most of a man. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would boast his ability to buy and sell Jacob Jepson. Mr. Jepson's slaves would boast his ability to whip Colonel Lloyd. These quarrels would almost always end in a fight between the parties, and those that whipped were supposed to have gained the point at issue. They seemed to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. So here's like another another society hierarchy, right? So we talked about that. Social status, because I can't spell hierarchy right now. So remember how we said like the slaves on the plantation had their own like social status, right? Like those that worked in the great house, those that worked in the on the garden seemed better than, and now here it's better for you to work for a rich slave owner like Colonel Lloyd than some poor slave owner. So those slaves saw themselves better than other slaves. Crazy, right? They're all still slaves. All right, so here's what I need you to do the last 5 minutes is I need for you, before we get too far, because we didn't do it